Thank you all for being here and braving a terrific winter storm here in Toronto. Don't worry, the Army's on its way. Montreal dies hard, yeah. Anyway, my name is Michael Meehan, and good evening. I have the honor to be Chancellor at McGill, and it's a pleasure for me to welcome you all to this very timely and topical event. So, needless to say, it's a great pleasure to see so many alumni and friends here this evening. And I should say that this year has been a banner year for McGill alumni in the GTA, because in addition to the usual number and variety of events organized by the McGill Toronto Alumni Association, we've also had our very first McGill Toronto Excellence Awards, which we held last June. And we honored a number of McGillians who live in Toronto, including Mike Babcock, who's familiar to you all as the coach of a team that plays in the same league as the Canadians. And he was the first winner of our Distinguished Leader Award. So I want you all to get out your calendars and put down Wednesday, June 19th, because that is the date of this next year's special luncheon here in Toronto. So June 19th, so Wednesday. You won't have gone up to Skok or wherever the heck you go. You'll be here, so don't miss it, please. And as you all know, with 26,000 graduates here in Toronto, we comprise the largest alumni group outside of Montreal. And I think most of us, all of us in fact, take pride in maintaining close ties with our university. Now, on your seat you will see a bit of literature that's been placed there by a McGill elf, or I don't know who, but it's a little Christmas present for you. Ask you to fill it out, please, so that we can really put together an alumni directory which will provide all of us with ways to search by faculty, location, and industry. So it really would be appreciated if you'd fill that out before you leave tonight. As you also know, I would think, we're beginning the countdown to our 200th anniversary in 2021. And for my sins, I'll still be Chancellor until the 30th of June in 2021. I may be in a wheelchair at that point, who knows. Anyway, it's just 3 years ago, we're 3 years away, I should say. I may make it yet. And we're going to have a bunch of events here in Toronto and elsewhere showcasing our alma mater as we build up to the 2021 campaign, which is underway already, and where we've had some initial success. I think that we're going to be announcing a pretty ambitious goal. You'll recall that last time we raised $1.026 billion, I think, very much needed dollars for the university, and it won't come as a great surprise to you. I don't think that the next campaign will have an even more ambitious goal. So anyway, let's get to this evening, because this is part of the highlighting by McGill of areas in which the university excels, such as global health, sustainability, innovation, entrepreneurship, artificial intelligence, neuroscience, and the challenges of public policy, which is what we're here to discuss tonight. So there are two parts to this evening. The first, we have a panel discussion, which I'm sure will be lively and interesting, entitled, "Which Media Can Be Trusted in the Global Digital Age?" This is a co-production with McGill's new Max Bell School of Public Policy, headed by Chris Reagan, who's here, of course. So special thanks to you, Chris, and to your colleagues for making this all happen. After the panel discussion, there'll be ample opportunity for questions and answers and some closing remarks from our wonderful Dean of Arts, Antonio Maione, who made it here in spite of the difficulties of flying in such dreadful weather. And then after that, of course, this is the third part, I guess, really, is the holiday party that'll take place next door. No fake news, no fake alumni, no fake, all for real, all for true, even the hors d'oeuvres and the drinks. So mingle and have a good evening. Unfortunately, I'm afraid, I know that one of our previous much-loved mayors, Barbara Hall, is here, and I unfortunately have a pre-existing dinner that I have to attend with their present successor. So, having said that, let me formally introduce Chris Reagan. He's the Associate Professor in the Department of Economics and Chair of Eco-Fiscal Commission, Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission, which was launched on November 2014, as I'm sure all of you know, with a 5-year mandate to identify policy options to improve environmental and economic performance in Canada. And in 2016, Chris was named to the Federal Minister of Finance's Advisory Council on Economic Growth. And last year, he became the inaugural director of McGill's Max Bell School of Public Policy. And his team is doing a fantastic job, as he was explaining to me, in rapidly bringing the school to the forefront of policy research and discussion. Thank you for your ongoing loyalty to McGill. I know it'll be an enjoyable evening. Bonne soirée à tous. Amusez-vous bien et n'oubliez pas de compléter la formule qui est sur votre siège. Thanks a lot. Good night.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you all for showing up. My name is Chris Reagan, and I am delighted to be the inaugural director of the new Max Bell School of Public Policy. I've been a McGill economist for, I think this is my 30th year. For all of those years, I have been wondering why McGill didn't have a School of Public Policy. I learned about 2 years ago that when Antonia Maoni was running around the country doing a feasibility study for a public policy school, there were many people in this country, when asked who has the best public policy school, many people said McGill does. So there's only one way I can go from there. Very liberating, very liberating. There are many things to do when building a school of public policy. And one of the things is to make sure that we have events like this in many cities, not just Toronto. We've done a launch in New York City. We did a launch in London last month. We had an event in Calgary. We have a few events in Montreal, of course. And we will be back in this fair city before you are expecting it, because we think it's very important that we get around the world and around the country to actually engage Canadians in discussions about important matters of public policy. So Michael asked you to bring out your calendar and mark down an event. I'm going to suggest 2 events that you might keep note of. February 5th, now that's not actually that far from now, but February 5th, if you can brave the weather and drive on the 401 to Montreal, we will have a large, interesting discussion about populism. Populism, where it comes from, what it means, whether it's a problem, what can be done about it, if anything. So that's February 5th at McGill in the Faculty Club. If you can't handle the drive and you want to wait a month, then you can wait until March 5th in this fair city. There will be a political insiders panel. We are going to have 3 political insiders, one from each of the major federal parties. You know what they are. And they are going to be commenting on what we should be looking for in the upcoming election. That's March 5th. So February 5th and March 5th are 2 that I would draw your attention to. There are other events as well, but those are the 2 that I will mention. Take a look at Max Bell School. You can put into Google, and you can see all of the events that we've got lined up. I've been the director of this school for just over a year, and for just under a year, we have been working hard to develop a new program, a new Master of Public Policy, MPP program. And on your chair, so Michael drew your attention to some propaganda and some literature. I will draw your attention to more propaganda and literature. If you take a look at this, and please do, take one, take two, take them home, give them to friends. This is the curriculum for the new MPP program at the Max Bell School. This program is designed to be different than the other programs that are out there. I won't mention what other universities have them, but you can imagine. This program is a little bit more practical. Actually, it's a lot more practical. It's got a bigger role for policy practitioners. We are very much trying to bridge the gap between policy practitioners and academics in the world of public policy. I encourage you to think about this program if you are looking to go back to school. Or if you are roughly my age and you have people still living in your basement or on your couch, and you would like them to get out and do something responsible, send them to us. We will take care of them for 11 months, and then we will get them a job. So take that home. Thank you. All right. Today's event is, as Michael said, which media can you trust? The way we've posed that question does suggest that there is some media that you can trust. You just have to decide which one or ones they are. But it's a very important topic in today's world. Today's world of super fast communications, very short media cycles, and a very polarized public conversation on many topics. So who do you trust? How do they build trust? Why does it matter? All of those things are going to be talked about in a few minutes. But before we get to the panel, I want to introduce two other individuals who have a little something to say. Ed Greenspon, Edward, he is sometimes known as Greenspon, is the CEO, president of the Public Policy Forum, and a good friend of mine, and he's about to come up here in about 30 seconds. And Taylor Owen is somebody that I have known only for a few months, but I am delighted to say that Taylor Owen, who currently is a professor in digital media and democracy kind of stuff at UBC, will be leaving that fine city and arriving in 2019 at the Max Bell School in McGill. So Taylor Owen and Ed Greenspon, come on up here and say a little something.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, sometimes known as Christopher Reagan. And good evening, everyone. As you're selling your populism event, which I want to come to, you might want to add that the Anaheim Mighty Ducks will be playing the Habs in Montreal that evening. So, it's just an added, tear up kind of thing, right? So look, we're just going to take 2 or 3 minutes. I'm delighted to be here with Taylor and with Chris and with McGill to just announce that we'll be launching a partnership starting in, probably tomorrow, because we got a lot of work. I was going to say early in the year, but I think tomorrow, between Public Policy Forum and the Max Bell School, and particularly with the Beaverbrook professor in ethics and media ethics at the Max Bell School. Taylor and I have been doing a lot of work together over the past 2 years. Taylor was a principal researcher on a report we did called The Shattered Mirror, which led to some kind of result last week that several of my friends on the front row aren't happy with, but did produce some money, hopefully, to help sustain journalism in Canada. And then we co-authored a report that came out this summer called Democracy Divided, Countering Disinformation and Hate in the New Digital Public Sphere. And that's also, I think, had a lot of traction. People, and this will be our partnership will be about disinformation. It will be about how disinformation and hate are attacking democratic institutions and social cohesion. And with a particular initial lens at the October 2019 election, but well beyond that as well. This exists in Canada. Some people think it doesn't exist in Canada. Misogynist motorists plowing down people in Toronto, and Quebec City mosque shooters, and our troops in Latvia who've been subjected to a lot of disinformation. You can go on and find a reversed Halloween picture of Justin Trudeau, and it looks as if, and tells you that he's converted to Islam. So it started up in Canada. And the first part of solving problems, understanding it, and we have no idea what goes on in our media ecosystem. We know less than most other countries know about that. And that is the point of the exercise, reconnaissance and research to understand that. And if you want to get into details, I would suggest you talk to an expert. Taylor.
Thanks. Well, this is my first McGill event, so I'm even more honored to be a part of this community. So thank you, Chris. Yeah, I mean, so Ed and I, and in my work particularly, is really around, I think, this crisis we're facing in the state of our information, and the way we get information, the quality of information, and the state of our public sphere in our democracy. Even just this year, we've seen foreign interventions in elections around the world. We've seen the collapse of the practice of journalism and the models of journalism in many countries. We've seen the spread of misinformation, the rise of hate speech and divisive content in our social platforms. And I think all of these point to this real core challenge we have in our democracy, which is how do we preserve the integrity of the information we receive that's required for us to be active citizens in a collective society. So this project that we're going to embark on is going to study this problem in Canada. Amazingly, while there's research centers in this around the world, there's monitoring labs around the world, there's very little in Canada. We know very little about how subject we are to this very problem, even though we know it exists. So the first thing we're going to do is set up a monitoring lab for the next year, watching this and studying it leading up to the next election. Who's trying to influence our beliefs, our votes? Who's trying to divide us on issues like pipelines and immigration, and inflame our rhetoric and our division between us leading up to the election? And can we then shape policy to help push back on it? So that's what we're going to be doing over the next year, years hopefully, and stay tuned. Thanks. And the one job my new boss gave me is to pass the mic to Andrew Potter, who will be moderating the panel and talking about one of the first studies we did in this, which was a study of media trust in Canada, and a survey he's gonna walk through. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. All right, thanks everyone. I want to get cracking on the panel, so why don't you guys come up and grab seats. But very briefly, thanks to Chris at the Max Bell School. Earlier this summer, he commissioned Taylor and me and Peter Lowen of U of T to do a study on media consumption habits in the country. And we asked people we asked 2,500 Canadians a bunch of questions on, what sort of media they consumed, what their political knowledge was, the values they expected from their journalism, and their various levels of trust in various forms of media. And the results, the first tranche of results we published in Policy Options last month. We have another tranche coming out soon. But the results are really interesting because unlike that narrative we have in the States of people living in increasingly polarized media silos that's exacerbating political division and so on, we found a few things, right? And the main thing was that even though Canadians have differing political views, and even though those views map onto the different ways in which they consume media, one interesting thing that emerged was that we live in a common world of facts. That is, this idea of separate facts for different political tribes has not yet caught on here, which is good news. And another piece of good news was Canadians have very high levels of trust in their mainstream media. That is, despite what we hear about, the New York Times and the big mainstream media in the United States being evacuative of public trust, the levels were really high. The Globe and Mail has trust levels 91%, CBC 92%, Post Media, or the National Post 86%, the Star 85%, compared to very relatively low levels of trust for digital startups, Vox, Vice, BuzzFeed, and so on. That's the good news, right? Common world of facts and high levels of trust. But there was one aspect. We also asked them what they thought about subsidies for the media, and the support was quite tepid. Now, clearly, the government's not reading policy options, but it led us to want to have this panel, right, to talk about trust, values, and so on in the mainstream media. And so if you read the original write-up for this, it sort of reeks of last summer's debates, which have kind of passed us by. I think we even referenced Elon Musk, who had some views on things. But I think it feeds quite nicely into what I want to talk about tonight, because I think we should probably not avoid the elephant in the room, which is the question of the subsidies that have been announced. And I want to use that, start talking about the subsidies, but use them not to talk about whether the media is going to be bought or what it'll do to the business models, but what it will do to two things, right? Our faith or our level of trust in the media, and also how it affects the values that we believe the media should aspire. So I'm going to get right to it. And so the panel, to my immediate left, David Skok, who is the CEO and editor-in-chief of The Logic, a digital tech startup here in Toronto. Jen Gerson, a freelance journalist who's flown in from Calgary. She's also a co-host of a bi-weekly political podcast called Oppo, which, did you record it today, or you just talked about it?
Sunday we're recording it.
Sunday, right. And finally, some of you might know Tony Keller, who's the Editorial Pages editor of the Globe and Mail. So let's have a hand for the panel. So I want to start with you, Jen, and why don't we just get right into it. The suite of announcements that were made last week on support for the media, what are your thoughts, specifically with respect to questions about trust and so on in the media?
Where would you like me to start on that one? I mean...
With your most recent Twitter post.
yeah, with my most recent Twitter fight with Gerry Butz, basically getting angry at him for dragging us into the partisan mess that I think that the government is trying to establish with these particular bailouts. Look, even if the Liberal government had announced this in a way that was totally impartial, totally neutral, completely free of any kind of partisan bias, which I would argue they have not, but even if they had done this all perfectly and properly, you are still setting us up to be pawns in a partisan game between the Liberals and the Conservatives. I mean, we've already seen the Conservatives launch a fundraising campaign against these bailouts. We've already seen groups like the Rebel sort of talk about, Liberal-friendly journalists being in the pockets of Justin Trudeau. There's a hashtag that was going around about Justin Journos. I mean, you simply cannot announce a bailout like this and not set people like me up to be pawns in a political game. There is no way to avoid that. So the Liberal government have chosen to accept that and believe that the bailout is more important than the credibility damage that it will be done to Canadian journalism and media as a result of it.
Dave?
Well, first, let me just say I really had a hard time processing my own thoughts on this, which is usually unusual for a journalist. You'd think we have lots to say. My own sense is, we founded The Logic this summer under the belief that for true journalistic independence, you have to have financial sustainability, independent financial sustainability. And so whether you're dealing with governments, whether you're dealing with advertisers, whether you're dealing with foundations, at some point, the rubber meets the road. And so the sooner or closer you can get to operating profitability, the more independence you can have as an organization. And so for me, while I personally don't think this is going to help The Logic and don't think it's going to be productive for Canadian journalism, if it is going to happen, I think we need to be really constructive and thoughtful about how we can do it in a way that does not impact the market dynamics and allow for both startups and traditional publishers to get to a place of cash flow positive as soon as possible. So how do we get there? And I wrote a column today that you're all more than welcome to read at The Logic, which outlines 7 ways that I think we can get it closer to where we would hope it can get to.
So one of the things that sort of interested us when we started putting this panel together back in the summer is been this this plethora of trust projects that have jumped up around the world, various trust initiatives. The Globe and Mail is part of one. The Toronto Star is part of another one. All built around this idea that, or based on the idea that one of the main things that ails the mainstream media is the decline of trust, and that rebuilding that trust or putting that trust on firmer ground is a mechanism for is a part of building the path to fiscal sustainability. Tony, you're the editorial pages editor, and I know you're not part of the Trust project specifically, but is there any sense in which that's part of the narrative of the work life in the newsroom now? Like trust, readership?
It's interesting. So, you know, to echo my two colleagues here, I think we all have various degrees of sort of reluctance about what the government's announced, and yet at the same time, a certain amount of understanding about why this whole issue has come up. And on the issue, and one thing that people should take from that is, it is one of the reasons to trust the established mainstream media, even though each one of us is kind of three different business models. I work for a business. You kind of are a business as a freelancer, and you have founded and run a business. And yet all of us are a little bit reluctant because we do feel like, you know, our job is to somehow embody trust, or to enable people to trust what we are producing. So I think it's an undercurrent beneath everything that everybody in the business does, is even when we aren't thinking about it constantly, when we're forced to think about it, we realize, look, unless people believe our brand, our publication, whether as individuals or as a whole company, can be trusted by the reader, we're in serious trouble. So I don't think all of us think about trust every minute of every day in the newsroom, even though the Globe is part of these various projects, but it underpins what we're doing.
Jen, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I mean, just following the ideas of trust. I mean, you know, how do we build trust with the audience and with the reader? Well, you know, I don't think you build trust by taking a government handout, right? I mean, that's no way to do it. I mean, you know, I think that David is entirely correct that, you know, independent media has to be financially sustainable media. I mean, no one's independent when they're living in their parents' basement. It doesn't exist, right? So, you know, what does an independent media landscape look like? You know, it's a landscape that's dominated by extremely plentiful, lively players who are absolutely willing to start a media organization from nothing, even in the face of a media landscape that's dominated by, you know, frankly, a very monopolistic set of media corporations, right? People like me and like David, who are just sort of starting in our careers and starting just at the verge of seeing what's possible for us to create for ourselves, right? We don't even know what we can create yet. You are hurting people like me when you hand the three largest monopolies in this country a thwack of cash. That kills people like me. People like me will thrive in a country that welcomes lively debate, provocative opinion, all kinds of challenging journalism, and I'm not going to be able to do that if the only organizations that I can reasonably build a career around are all fundamentally dependent on government subsidy and are all fundamentally dependent upon a narrow sort of independent panel of journalists narrowly defining what journalism is, right? And living in an environment where people are afraid to push boundaries and challenge some of the establishment people in media. I mean, that is lethal to someone like me.
I'm truly flattered that Jen thinks I'm young enough to be at the start of my career. Unfortunately, there are some gray hairs here. So
it's because you started a business.
So, you know, I've been doing this for 20 years, and prior to starting The Logic, I was at the Boston Globe, where I was the managing editor. And, you know, you kind of look at the evolution over the last 2 decades of journalism in this country and around the world, and how the business model and the incentives that we created as a business and the paths we chose and the decisions we made led us down a path of scale, the pursuit of scale at all costs. And so when we get to trust, I'm getting to trust, it's a long-winded way of getting to it, which is part of that pursuit of scale resulted in reporters having to file 5, 6, 7, 10 stories a week. And when you're filing that many stories just so you can have enough page views to pay the bills, which CPMs started eroding as Google and Facebook started to put more pressure on those ad impressions. When you have reporters having to file that much that quickly and without having a second to pause, it's no wonder that people start to say, wait a minute, you misquoted me, Or wait a minute, you lack the nuance and thoughtfulness and depth and niche of that story that I was trying to tell you. And so that slowly chips away at trust. And so the business model that we chose in the pursuit of advertising, the pursuit of scale, led us down a path where the journalists had no time to take the depth, thoughtfulness that we need to do. So, we flipped it on its head. We are a subscription business based solely on the fact that we're going to do stories that we think are worth reporting and take the time to do it. Every reporter has weeks to do one story. And part of that is to try to rebuild trust. And you rebuild trust by being thoughtful and by having nuance and depth in your reporting. And so, I think, decisions that were taken in newsrooms over the past 20 years, for the best of intentions, led us down this path where we eroded trust.
Yeah, and if I can just further that to try to specify what, how do we in the business quantify trust? And one way of quantifying it, which you've just touched on, is can you get people to actually pay for your publication? Can you get people to put down not just their time, but their money in both cases? And so, in the case of the Globe, and again, I'm an employee. I'm not a member of the Thompson family. I don't own the Globe and Mail. But the structure of the Globe is to not focus on page views. That was sort of the beginning of the internet, was let's maximize page views. And what publications like ours focus on is how do we get people to actually subscribe. So we're much more interested in publishing the kinds of things that will cause people to pay for the publication than we are in saying, could we get one more click? Could we get one more click? Could we get one more click? So that, in a way, has become our definition of trust, is do people trust us enough to want to become subscribers, to want to make essentially a financial commitment to this publication.
So let me throw something else into the mix on this issue. It's the second piece of the study we have coming out in policy options has to do with some questions we asked readers about their values, how they ranked or ordered or balanced various journalistic values. So we asked them, is it important to you that a newspaper or a media outlet tell both sides of the story, right? Is it important to you that it is fast, or first to a story? Is it important to you that there is a division between opinion and news? And we got a fairly interesting result, which is that for those who consume media through either print or digital news without going through social networks, that is, if they just go to the homepage or what have you, they have very high belief in the traditional news values, right? The ones that have animated North American journalism for the 20th century. For those who used one or more social media networks to access their news, there was a much higher desire to see a mix of news and opinion combined in one story, much lower faith in balance, the sense that telling both sides was a vice, not a virtue, and so on. And the results were so stark that it suggests that there's almost two models of journalism emerging. There's the model, there's the old model, which is sort of transitioning awkwardly to the digital space, and then there's social media-driven journalism. But news organizations are trying to do both, right? Most newsrooms are doing both types. And I wonder, in an environment in which you're trying to build trust, which audience are you trying to build it? Whose values, right, are going to come to dominate in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years is an interesting question. I don't know.
Well, I think you're seeing a lot of different things happening. I mean, one is you just see people write more. We all do. We write more with voice. There is far more voice writing. There's far more of a personal tone, and you see that, and that's the connection through social media. But at the same time, I do think what your survey is finding is surely true, which is that there is a reader who is concerned that the climate has become so heightened that everyone is at the extreme, that this is either the greatest idea in history or that politician is the stupidest person who ever walked the earth. So there's a hunger for something that's in between that says, well, let's analyze this on balance. Let's look at this. Let's report this fairly. And people want to have the confidence that things are being honestly analyzed, honestly reported.
Jen, you're a reporter, but you have opinions.
Just a few, on occasion.
Every now and then.
Keep it to a minimum.
Is there conflict there?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that we're moving into an era in which readers are building more of a relationship and more of a trust relationship with individuals, as much as they're building that relationship with institutions. Newspapers have always published columns and analysis pieces as well as publishing, news pieces. That's not new. What's new is the idea that someone like me can live in both worlds, that we could swim in both seas, right? And what I think is very interesting is that, when I started in my career, 10 years ago now, oh God. But the idea that you could do both was really like, oh no, I don't think you're allowed to do both. That's not cool. And as my career progressed, and as there fewer and fewer people were in the newsroom, and as the relationship with the reader just fundamentally changed, I think there was just a lot more openness for someone like me to sort of do a reported piece and then do something analytical and then do a column piece. And we found that the readers really came with us on that journey. Like they got it. They got that this was a column piece and this was a reported piece. They could tell just by the tone, by the way it was presented. And I think that when people are generally reading my stuff, they're not expecting a complete straight down the line, he said, she said type reported piece from me anymore. That's not the brand that I've built, and that's not the audience I've built. So I think that the readers are a little bit more sophisticated than we've given them credit for in that regard.
Dave, what are the animating virtues of the logic?
The animating virtues of the logic are, one of them is building a community. We're building our own community, and of course it would never rival or attempt to rival that of the social networks, but subscribers to the logic, I hope, are feeling like they are a part of something, part of a movement to create a new type of journalism, a part of a place where we can have a safe conversation about the future of the country. Our site is about the future of the innovation economy in Canada. And if you care about the innovation economy, you care about the future of the country, our goal is to give people permission to have difficult conversations that they wouldn't have without us. That's one of journalism's driving forces to me is, you look at the Me Too movement. It took the New York Times and the New Yorker to report on Harvey Weinstein for this massive global conversation to take place. So one of our jobs is to be that catalyst, and my hope is that the logic can be that. Before we move on, I don't want to absolve the social networks themselves of their responsibility on this, in that, let's go to Marshall McLuhan here and look at the medium. These mediums, these platforms, have been designed, as we know now that they were designed for a long period of time, to heighten engagement, to heighten, to keep you on site as long as possible and to keep you excited with what you're seeing. Taylor's research is leading on this front. And so when you created these platforms and nobody was aware of it over the last 10 years to heighten engagement, it naturally gravitated the type of journalism that succeeded on those platforms to be the stuff that enraged or enlightened or engaged, not more than enlightened. And so it doesn't surprise me that your findings reflect that because it is based on platform. When you look at print, one of the beautiful things about print is to get to Tony's beautiful words, you first have to scroll through 18, 20, 24 pages of news. So by the time you get to the column or the opinion or the letter from the editor, you have a bit of a sense of what you're about to embark on. In a digital world, that's completely lost, and you go straight to it without any context or meaning. And so platforms matter in how we think about the journalism and how it's at least received by a reader.
I call them validation slot machines.
There you go.
That's what they're designed to be. Just keep pulling the slot, keep pulling the slot. That's what
and
Twitter
make
right?
you want to keep pulling
Yeah.
it. And the funny thing is, to come back to where we started with trust, I would suspect, you talked about the logic and building a community, and one of the funny things about that term is because of social media and because social media has so used the term building a community, that it's quite possible that if you were to do a survey on when people hear the words build a community, do they feel positively or negatively about that? Probably a lot of people now feel negatively because it's been so misused by social media, for something other than what we would normally think of as community.
Well, I also don't think that we should get into entirely self-righteous on this one and assume that all of the old journalism values were perfect and untouchable either. I mean, one of the other flip sides of that, or if I were to play devil's advocate, I would say is that social media has created a reader that's much more sophisticated in a lot of ways and no longer expects its journalism to be totally unbiased. It builds in a certain degree of skepticism into its journalism, and I don't think that's necessarily unhealthy either. I kind of want readers who are going to take anything that I write and in their heads challenge my arguments, challenge my opinions, challenge what I have to say, and not be afraid to tell me when they disagree with me, so long as it's in a constructive and non-abusive way.
And it's
Big caveat. So like I think that there's two sides to that. Is that the denigration of trust is a broad problem, but if we're presenting good arguments, good facts, and good analyses, that we should not be afraid of that either.
I would guess, though, that
sorry, go ahead.
if you were to go back into the archives of the Globe and Mail and somebody could look up all the letters from the editor back in 1926, I don't know if it would be very different to what we have today. The only difference is there was somebody deciding whether to publish that or not, and today you don't have that.
Exactly. That's the key thing that I think has changed in the discourse, is there were these gatekeepers, and the Globe and Mail would have been one of those official gatekeepers, and it was merely a function of you need, to be a gatekeeper, you need to purchase a printing plant and a large number of employees and a lot of newsprint and tons of ink, and you don't have to do that anymore. So that, I came back to where I was before, where I said, you're founding a publication, you're your own brand, and I work for one. And the truth is, those are things that were not, they didn't stand on an equal plane once upon a time, and they can now. So it's been much more democratized. There are good things about that, and there are bad things about that. It's a complicated story.
That's well put.
Thank you.
What I want to talk about the sort of second half of this is the way this conversation was set up was supposed to be about trust, but also professionalism. And that was where the Elon Musk thing came in. You guys might remember when Elon Musk last summer got irritated at some analysts who said mean things about Tesla. That he said, I'm going to set up ratemyjournalist.com. Right? And he said, you guys, you're just like taco stands or anything. You can be ranked, right? There can be people giving you a score. And I kind of thought, it's true, right? We have ratemyprofessor.com, right? We've got ratemytacohut.com, right? I mean, there's Yelp. There's ranking engines everywhere. And I know, Dave, you have views on this. And I actually didn't think it was that big of a deal. I thought, sure, why not? But the reaction within the journalist community was quite hostile to this idea, because there's this, Doug Saunders, one of your colleagues, said something like, this is preposterous. Journalism can't be ranked because journalism isn't a thing. It's an impulse of humanity or something like that, right? Or an impulse of citizenship, I think he said. Now, we can have that fight. We were going to have that fight, except something new is on the table, which is that the government has established a panel, or is going to establish a panel, of independent journalists whose job it will be to decide who gets the money, or some of the money that's being handed out. And as Ivor Shapiro of Ryerson wrote in a column yesterday, this sets us inevitably on the stage towards some kind of ranking or credentialing of journalists. That is, whether we like it or not, we're going to have to decide who is a journalist or not. And how that plays out is going to be very interesting. Dave, why don't you start? Like, I know you don't like the idea, but are we heading there anyway? Is this panel going to get us there? Get us to some kind of college of journalists or licensing of journalists
So Ivor and I share something, which is we're both South African. I was born in South Africa, lived there until 1988, so right during the height of apartheid. And for those that remember, at that time, there was no free press at that time in South Africa. It was completely censored. You had the SABC, the government-controlled broadcaster, and everything was essentially controlled by the government. When I left, I was awoken to the world of what a free press looks like, and that's why my view on this is it is a slippery slope. Maybe I'm naturally a cynic as a journalist, that's my job, but I like to assume what's the worst case scenario. Play this out with someone who isn't a fair, decent-minded politician, and it's, I'm afraid, getting a lot easier to think about that scenario than it was even 3 years ago. So play that out. But the bigger issue for me on this is that I just fundamentally don't view journalism as an industry. Journalism is an act. Anybody in this room, any one of you can do an act of journalism. It may not be very good, and as your editor, I may scold you for it, but fundamentally, it is your right as a citizen of this country to commit acts of journalism. And so if we go down the path where we start to determine the credentialing of journalists and what it is that makes you professional, I believe we lose something that's kind of fundamental to living in a free society. Yes, I understand the nuance of, well, it's a long way from a media panel deciding who gets government funding all the way through to the doomsday scenario that I imagine, which is why I'm trying to be constructive about it and frame the options.
I don't think it's so far.
But I think, well, then I'll stop talking and let Jen finish my sentence.
Well, I would make 2 points. One, are you comfortable with Ezra Levant sitting on that panel? If the answer to that question is no, then the panel's a bad idea.
Yeah, that's the Paul Wells gambit, right?
Yep,
Paul Wells.
that's
He said they should appoint Pierre Paul Over to run it. Right?
Yep.
Yeah, there you go. The second point, I'm going to take this into a really, really practical space, and I'm going to say, so, I'm an independent journalist now. I have 4 or 5 sort of core clients. Okay, all of my clients in some way receive directly or indirectly government subsidy. I am not comfortable with that reality, but that's just what it is. I can't build a career as a freelance journalist in this country without relying on some form of direct or indirect government subsidy. That's not because I can't compete in a free market, it's because we don't have a free market, period. Okay, so what happens in a scenario where we have a group of independent journalists who maybe are broadly aligned with me ideologically and maybe aren't, who knows? But they're deciding who gets to be a journalist, or what outlets get to be a journalist. Well, we're also heading into an era where it's an increasingly censorious age. Say I say the wrong thing on Twitter, or I say the wrong thing on a CBC panel, and that organizing body gets pressured by social media or whatever else to pull my credentials. Now I can't publish in any of my clients. My career is gone. Even if that is a nightmare scenario, even if that's the 1 in 1,000 scenario, how does that impact the way that I think? How does that impact the way that I work? I can tell you it's already impacting it. It's impacting it now. I can't tell you how many conversations I have with people my age, of people who are afraid to have opinions about things, who are afraid to say what they really think about things because they know what will happen.
So, okay, so hey,
Let me just follow up on that. I think I'm not in the camp that says this is the absolute worst case scenario, but we all have reluctance about what the government, to varying degrees, about what the government has proposed. In fairness to the government has been pushed into this by the industry. The established industry is the one that has been saying, you have to do something for us, you have to do something for us, you have to do something for us. And the government for 3 years has been saying, maybe we'll do it next month or next year, and has been putting it off. I think there's been a healthy reluctance on the part of the government to do anything, though they ultimately did. And there's been a healthy reluctance on the part of journalists, working journalists, to accept this. It's the industry that's sort of been somewhat more comfortable for obvious reasons.
Well, that's not what we mean by the industry then.
Well, no, but I mean those who actually own various parts
We're
of
talking about the
existing print media.
owners. We're talking about we're not the monopolistic owners of industry.
Well,
right?
How are they monopolistic?
Well, I don't know. How would you define monopoly in Canadian media?
Do you think the Globe and Mail is a monopoly? You can
Yes.
subscribe or really? Because you can subscribe.
Probably
you can subscribe or not subscribe. And again, I don't.
Yeah.
I just work here.
I
You
mean,
can subscribe or not subscribe.
It's getting there, don't you
It's not
think?
official monopolies.
I mean, is Postmedia a monopoly?
well, hang on.
Right?
I mean,
I don't know, is it?
Tony. No, I agree. Tony, your I just work here routine is working very well. But
I literally do.
I know you do. So which is good because I know that the Globe and Mail has a guide to ethics that it passes around. Now, I'm as happy as anyone that there is no licensing for journalists in a very strict sense, because the first day I ever went into a newsroom was the day I started as the news editor at the Ottawa Citizen, and I didn't know anything because I didn't know anything about journalism.
Yeah, neither you nor I have ever been to a journalism school,
So-
and thus have no qualifications officially to be journalists.
Yeah, so which worked out well enough. But we also had at the Citizen, but also when Dave says, it's not an industry, it's an act, right? Okay, fair enough. But we had a book at the Citizen called Guide to Professional Ethics for Employees, right? And it wasn't just a recitation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the relevant sections, right? And a declaration of citizenship and obligations. It was how you should conduct yourself in public in announcing or presenting yourself to sources. What it means to have something on or off the record, right? It was actually professional guidelines.
Okay, but
right?
that guidebook didn't appear wholesale one year, in 1982. the professional guidelines that govern how we act and behave as journalists has been an evolving process for, 100 years now?
Sure.
So like the idea that like this is the guidebook that we're going to be going by, and this is what we're stuck with forever, and that this is 2018, we got it. Like this is it.
Yeah,
The idea that there's going to be no evolution in terms of how we conduct ourselves, or no evolution in how journalism works, and no evolution in what defines ethical or non-ethical journalism. I think that's what's naive here.
If I can try to, I think, answer what you're trying to say, which is, yes, the guidebooks existed, but they existed during a time of monopoly, in the sense of you did have to own a printing press. We had this completely integrated model where you needed to own the distribution, the engineering, the delivery, the advertising. It was all your thing. And so as a result of that professionalization, ironically, we were more professional as an industry then than today because of the fragmentation that has taken place through disruption. So now that we're in this disrupted, fragmented place, I'm not sure how, practically, you can force that professionalization on people without stepping on some of the democratic principles that you want to protect in this country. Maybe if we were to go back and the way disruption works, we will eventually go back to an integrated model. Maybe when we go back to that integrated model, you can professionalize it a little bit, but it seems very hard to me that a CP style guide, Canadian Press style guide, or a Globe and Mail policy and practices handbook is written for anything other than truly market forces. I'm going on a tangent here, but Lawrence Lessig wrote the Law of the Code, or Code 2.0, which he said was, essentially the law of the code that market forces and wisdom of the crowd would essentially force you into a law. And I don't think it's very different in journalism, where in order to succeed as a business, you had to adhere to these principles, but not necessarily that those principles were an entry into the business.
What the principles were and are about, to come back to this topic, trust, which is, you're right, anybody can commit an act of journalism. I mean, anybody can go on Twitter or Facebook and say, I have discovered something that you need to know about. And that, they could change the world with that. But at the same time, journalism is, for the most part, at the moment, still a business, in the sense that there are organizations with people whose entire job is devoted to doing things like that, to doing those acts of journalism. The difference from the past is, you now have just regular people who can do it. So it's evolved to being both. I don't think it's gone from one to the other extreme. It's just shifted. That's the way I would look at it.
So I mean, I would just make this point is that so I'm an independent journalist and I'm not bound by any particular guidebook or style book. Why am I not going around tweeting lies all day? Well, because my bread's on my credibility. That's where my income comes from, right? The reason why I have a following and I have an audience and I have organizations willing to pay me for my work is because I have a reputation that I have to maintain. I have a business interest in maintaining that reputation.
Okay, so, but let's say I was right. That, I mean, if this panel gets set up, right, it's going to happen, right? And he suggests, he says, look, well, if it's going to happen, it's not unheard of. In fact, France has a college of journalists, right? In the same way there's colleges of surgeons and so on, right? Where you just set up certain, professional standards, right? Because we all agree there's a difference between, interviewing a subject, going to someone else for comment or reaction, holding back on something that's told you off the record. There's a difference between that and standing on the street yelling that you hate the government, right? So both are acts of citizenship. One is an act of journalism, one's not. Is it not?
Well, okay,
am I wrong?
Well, yeah.
You took the most extreme example, but
Yeah.
No, but I mean, look, black and white are extremes, right?
Is Ontario proud journalism? Is press progress journalism? Is Alberta progress journalism? Is the rebel journalism? Because I mean, that's the realm we're in anymore. Nobody's debating about whether or not the Globe and Mail is journalism. No one's debating about the logic.
Yeah.
For the most part, no one's debating about me. Although if you go into the really far into Twitter occasionally. But it's the hard cases in which you're going to have to decide this. And my philosophy in all of this is you don't be prescriptive about this at all. It's all journalism. It's all acts of citizenship. That's all it is. So the second you get a panel together saying this is that and this is out, I think we're in totally murky, totally dangerous territory.
So again, in the old world, this was probably easier to handle because this is exactly the reluctance I have, is the concern of where's the line and who's going to draw the line and how are we going to draw the line, and then when the government shifts, how's the line going to shift?
Yep.
These are all real questions. In the past, it was, okay, we're going to set up a program to benefit magazines. We're going to subsidize their postage. And we kind of all agreed on what a magazine was. It wasn't hard to do. It's more challenging. This isn't one where I have an easy answer to offer people, other than I think there's a reason to have reluctance, and there's a reason to say if the government's going to do this, let's make sure it's done in a way that it is as temporary and as arm's length as possible, if that's how it's going to be. And we need to think very hard about how to make that happen.
I haven't resigned myself to the inevitability of this yet.
You know, I agree, you know, the answers, there are no easy answers, that's certainly true, but I do think the questions is where I get hung up. That, you know, the question to me is not, what do we do to save the industry of journalism or to save newspapers or to save jobs that have gone and may never come back now? That is not the question that we should be asking when we speak of journalism and its role in society and what government can do. The question that we should always be asking, from my perspective, is how do we ensure a free press in a society? Period, full stop. And then it's up to me as part of the market. I started an organization 5.5 months ago, and we're going to sink or swim based on whether we have a market for our product. And our product is high-quality journalism. That's for us to decide. I think the questions that we should be thinking about more are clearly, you know, my big beef is, if you want a real thing that you can help with the government, okay, let's reform our access to information laws. Because we have some of the worst in the world. And it's embarrassing that Canada in 2018, who invented access to information laws, is up there with redacted copies of almost everything. That's how you support journalism, not by funding it.
Good, that's where I want to end this. So I think what we'll do is, so I think that's right. I like that when you wrote that about that should be the orientation of our question, how to ensure a free press, right? And I like your answer. I think we'll get Jen's answer and Tony's, and then open up for questions.
Sure. I mean, the other thing I would just, as an addition to what David just said, is like, let's not pretend that the government already hasn't massively intervened in the media market through the creation of, oh, I don't know, the CBC. Like, if you have
Highly trusted.
Well, yeah, highly trusted, exactly. But I mean, if you have concerns, and these are legitimate, real concerns about what happens once Postmedia collapses, for example, and how are people, you know, especially in underserviced communities, going to have access to local news? Okay, let's not pretend the CBC doesn't exist. And I think David, you made this point in your column quite brilliantly. Is like what the conversation about the CBC's mandate and the CBC's role, especially in the next 5 to 10 year period as we go through what I think is going to be an accelerated collapse, or maybe a slightly slower collapse now. You know, the CBC has a role to play in sort of filling out the holes and where the market is going to fail. So let the CBC do that, and then the CBC needs to have a real conversation with itself about how it pulls back and doesn't wind up smothering every other potential startup and every other potential news organization in the process of creating whatever comes next.
So, you know, every action has some kind of equal and opposite reaction, and any money that gets put into the CBC or propping up existing media makes life more difficult for people like David. I mean, there are a whole series of new publications coming up. They're smaller, they're leaner, they're online only. And if we devote all of our efforts to sort of figuring out how to keep, you know, the Toronto Star as is going for 1 more year or 2 more years or 3 more years, are we doing a service to the future of journalism, or are we undermining the arrival of the future of journalism? You know, I don't claim to have a clear-cut answer on that, but I think that is a reasonable question to ask. There are things happening out there in the media space. Good and hopefully you all remain subscribers to the Globe and Mail. Thank you.
Great stuff. Let's have some questions. I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions. There's a microphone over here. Is this the one microphone? Second one over there. So if you have a question, put up your hand, and we've got one right here.
I think David mentioned building a community, but I think all the panelists have kind of covered that topic in some form or another. And I feel like building that community allows room for more lax journalism or less truthful journalism, in that the followers of your community will be more inclined to agree with you or believe what you have to say. And I was wondering how you guys address that, or what you guys do to avoid falling into that trap of becoming more lax.
Anyone particularly want to answer it?
Let's go with David first.
Yeah, sure. Well, I can tell you that they don't always agree with me. I hear about it, and I hear about it in a couple of ways, and this is how we manage that. You need release valves, I think, for people to vent. So we have a Slack channel that is for subscribers only, and the Slack channel itself is one thing, but I get a lot of DMs. It's direct access to me, and I answer every single one. I know when Andrew was at the Citizen, he answered every single reader.
Oh, yeah.
It's what you do, and most of the time, I say most of the time, even if people don't agree with you and you're reporting, generally speaking, if you're able to defend it and explain it, it diffuses the situation and builds a more vibrant community because you're accessible. And I think that's part of it too, is being accessible. We are not in a privileged environment anymore where we have up on high like a Edward R. Murrow or a Walter Cronkite who sits there and just tells you how it is. We have to be there engaging. However, having said that, I would say I do think some of this course correction is a bit overrated in that you need to be out in the community and listening. The best way to be a reporter is still by being out in the community and listening and finding ideas and reporting. And sometimes we trip over our own skis to say, no, we are part of our community. And it still comes down to just really solid journalism so that if people may not like what you write, but if it's truthful, generally speaking, they're not going to have any issues with it.
Can I just say that I answered every email except the 3,500 I got when we canceled 5 pages of comics and puzzles.
Bridge Column did that. The Bridge Column, I had a similar issue.
Crazy.
Yep.
I think one of the lines between sort of, one of the questions about what is community and what does it mean, how do you maximize it, is if you have a community of interest, then possibly you're doing journalism. If you have a community of sort of agreement on everything, then that's not really going to be journalism anymore. So if people are all interested in the topic, but they're willing to have various different perspectives on the topic, you could be doing journalism. If it's just, I want to hear that government X, policy X, party X is good, and I just want that constantly repeated, that's probably not going to be journalism.
I would just point out that I would try and ground that concern in history. The idea of on-high gatekeeper style journalism, and that the Grey Lady shall tell us what truth is, and everything is objective. And not only was that gone, but it's not even that old. That's a relatively novel thing. I mean, newspapers, most of our newspapers were explicitly partisan when they were founded, explicitly partisan. They were founded by rich men and people who were connected to political parties who wanted to have a vehicle for their particular political viewpoints to get out into the world. The notion of objective journalism, as we've understood it since the 70s and 80s, that's the new thing, that's the novel thing. So, if you go into the UK today, you will still see 10, 12 newspapers all explicitly devoted to totally different partisan points of view. So this is not new. This is not new at all. Objective journalism is what's new. And I think that we have to sort of sometime remember that and sort of reground ourselves in that reality and understand that a little bit better.
Okay. Any more questions? James?
Sure. Thanks. You talked a lot about subscriptions, and people have to put their money down. And I see that as the real act of citizenship in the 21st century is putting your money down and saying, I'm going to pay for my journalism. And my concern is that people think information and journalism is for free, and I don't agree that anybody can commit an act of journalism that's just yelling in the town square. I think journalism is a real thing. But when I ride the subway and I don't see people with the newspapers, I see them on their phone, and it's not the online version of the Logic or the Globe. It's Candy Crush, and it's things that I just look at and fear for our society. And I teach civics and history in school, and so I'm trying to get my kids to understand the importance of being informed, because that's the first piece of citizenship. How do we get people to understand that they need to pay for informed and good journalism in today's world?
We're trying. No, and look, for what it's worth, I think the Globe has managed, for the moment, to continue to be able to do that. It is, for the moment, a functioning business model. You're in the Globe and Mail building. It has 4 stories. of 3 stories of people doing journalism, selling ads, creating products, and this event space up here. So we're still a business, but the whole business is kind of challenged because it was built on a very different business model. I mean, Jen talks about all the things that are new in journalism. The moment we're in now is new, but the model we had before, the model for journalism since the late 19th century was actually not you paying for the newspaper. The model was advertisers paying for you. And advertisers were paying to get your eyeball, and we were the agora. We were the place that all the ads were in. So that model's fallen apart, and that's why we're talking about how to get you to pay for journalism instead of telling advertisers that we have your eyeball, so please buy an ad with us. That's the thing that's changed dramatically. So we are actually asking you something different than what our business model asked you even 15 years ago.
I'll give you one stat from the Logic, which is 80% of our readers are under the age of 45. So this notion that young people won't pay is patently false from my experience. It's actually older people that won't pay. They got used to the gravy train, and they don't want to give it up. So that's the one thing. The second thing I would say is we're all part of the same ecosystem. And I've seen this from my perspective. When we report a story that's really good and that's really impactful and powerful, not everybody's going to read it because not everybody subscribes to the Logic. But you know who is reading it? These guys.
Other journalists, yeah, absolutely.
And what they're going to do is amplify our work. And I'm actually totally fine with that because I got to get a brand out there. I want the policy to change. And so we all work in an ecosystem that is actually helpful to each other. That's 2. And then the third thing I would say is it's early days. If you go back to film, in 1897, the Lumiere brothers invented film. And you had trains flying at you in black and white, and people hiding under the seats so scared they thought this was a new novel thing. 20 years later, or 25 years later, we were still in the Charlie Chaplin era of film. The internet is just 27, 28 years old. Taylor, maybe you're in that area, or the World Wide Web is. So it's early days. And as part of those early days, I look at Tesla as a good example, where Elon Musk, for better or worse, he had an idea and a vision, and he said, I want to build electric cars. I want to get people onto electric power. And the best way for me to do that right now is to build a high-end luxury car that covers my costs. And so people went out and spent $250,000 to $350,000 on a Tesla Model whatever. Now they're making $40,000 Teslas, and you have auto manufacturers around the globe with battery-powered cars and hybrids, and it moved the whole market in that direction. So with that time frame of Charlie Chaplin, and just think about the fact that, things like the Logic, I'm really proud of what we're doing. But one of the reasons I'm proud of it is because we're hopefully setting the stage for other things down the road to come in at much lower price points that are far more accessible to more people.
And I would just add to that, and I would say, I think you're putting the onus of responsibility on the wrong people. It's not your job to be convinced of my value. It's my job to convince you of my value. If I can't do that, and if my organizations can't do that, then we deserve to die.
Maybe one last question from anyone on this side of the room? Have a question? I feel like John Bon Jovi. Over there. Yeah?
Hi. Just wanted to ask, with the new media and the old media, I think old media added a lot of credibility most recently, like last 10 or 20 years. They have evolved into focused more on facts and investing into investigative journalism. Meanwhile, nowadays there's stories that break. We don't know if it's real or not, and even if they're real, then who's gonna do all that investigative work in the new group of people? So just wanted your opinion on that.
I think there's 2 things that you pointed out there that I would say is that the preponderance of bad faith fake news, which I think is a slightly different category than what we've been talking about today. So these are people who are actively trying to deceive people and generate clicks using deception techniques. That actually is a pernicious little cancer, and I think that the presence of fake news is actually an incredible business opportunity for someone who's a credible actor. I've yet to see really a Canadian Snopes. or PolyFact come forward actually willing to tackle some of those things. And I think that if somebody were really interested in doing a cheap and cheerful startup, that seems like a really obvious place for me to start. You know, if this government money were, instead of propping up Postmedia and the Globe and Mail and all these other organizations, were instead to create some kind of like one-time startup fund, and I could get access to say $500,000 and create a startup fund that would like, you know, abolish fake news and try to create a business model out of that, that's where I'd be putting my attention, my money. I can't get access to that money though, because that doesn't, as far as I'm aware, exist in this market. The second thing I would think you would point out is what was the, who's going to do the investigative work? Probably some of the old organizations are still doing investigative work, but the idea that there's no business for, or there's no market for investigative journalism, I think is incorrect. I think there's a huge appetite and a huge market for investigative journalism. It's just kind of like the next stage of the business model, and we're starting to see organizations, for example, Canadaland, they just hired Jaron Curtis for a year to do an investigation of the We charity, for example. I think you're just going to start to see more and more of that as the internet evolves.
Yeah, I mean, our you know, big part of our bread and butter is investigative work. I mean, essentially, yours is investigative work. I mean, you're doing hard reporting. So I think there's a lot there, and I think you should go and pitch that startup idea to. There are several ways you can get money from this government fund. I don't know. I think you may be able to do it.
That's right. Okay.
That would be highly ironic.
All right, let's have a big hand for the panel. David Skok, Ken Gerson, Tony Keller. While you guys go off to receive your prizes, I'd like to welcome, it's my pleasure to welcome, introduce the Dean of Arts, Antonio Maioni, to come up and close the evening off with some
Watch your step here.
announcements.
Thank you, Andrew. Bonsoir à tous. Je vous apporte pas trop de neige, mais des bonnes nouvelles de McGill, et ça me fait un grand plaisir d'être avec vous. Je suis Antonia Maioni, et je suis la doyenne de la Faculté des Arts de l'Université McGill. It's really such a pleasure to be here with you all this evening in this beautiful space. I have to say that it looks a lot different than the old digs, the Globe and Mail on Front Street, and it's a great improvement, and I think it's very fitting that we've had this conversation about journalism and about the media in the home of one of Canada's great news institutions. So thank you very much for agreeing to have us here to the Globe and Mail. I'm also delighted to see so many arts graduates here this evening among our guests, and former students too, so that's always a treat for a professor of political science. Andrew Potter, of course, is a graduate. Michael Meehan is a graduate. Ed Greenspon is a graduate. So many of the people who were organizing this very event and participating in it are also our graduates, and it's wonderful to see them all here thriving in Toronto with close ties to McGill. Just last evening, in fact, Chancellor Meehan and I had the pleasure of attending a convocation dinner for another well-known McGill grad who is a Toronto resident and alumni, Ken Dryden, who was awarded an honorary doctorate last night. And I'm not sure how many six-time Stanley Cup winners have had that honor of an honorary doctorate, but I think he's the first at McGill. And we're very, very proud of him. And now we can call him Dr. Dryden. So that's good news for us at McGill. I also want to repeat the shout out to Taylor Owen, who will now be joining our McGill community, so the newest member of the club and the new kid on the block. So congratulations and welcome. Taylor will be the Beaverbrook Chair in Media Ethics and Communications at the Max Bell School of Public Policy. He joins no less than 17 new recruits that are going to be coming and joining the ranks of the Faculty of Arts in everything from artificial intelligence to Indigenous studies. So we are, in fact, in the middle of a great renewal in the Faculty of Arts and indeed across the university as we lead towards some of our important strategic areas in research, teaching, and outreach. And of course, the McGill's initiative in public policy is one of those very important new streams. I'd like to thank Chris Reagan, our inaugural director, for all of his leadership in bringing the vision to fruition and in establishing the Max Bell School of Public Policy. He's done an extraordinary job. I'd like to thank Andrew Potter, our moderator, for leading the discussion, for keeping us on track. And I'd like most of all to thank Jen Gerson, Tony Keller, and David Skok for an extremely informative discussion. And together, let's have a hand of applause for that.
I wouldn't have kicked you off stage.
Yeah,
I thought you were just getting on.
Thanks, Antonio.
All right.
And I just wanted to say that it's very rare that you get an opportunity like this to hear great leaders and great voices in the media community talk to us so frankly and so openly about trust, about truth, about professionalism, which I thought was a very important part of that conversation, and of course, the whole idea of not only what is a journalist and what is journalism, but indeed what is the future of the free press. So thank you all very much.
That's great. Thanks,
for
Antonio.
being part of that conversation. Thank you. Finally, I'd just like, in closing, to remind you all that one of the aspirations of the McGill's Initiative in Public Policy, and indeed the Max Bell School of Public Policy, was to realize some very lofty aspirations. And one of the central ones was to be able to continue what we've done at McGill for generations, which is to create future leadership in Canada, future leadership in research, future leadership in teaching, future leadership in a wide variety of areas. And now, with the Max Bell School of Public Policy, to create future leadership in really where our country is going to be going. Ça a été l'attente de l'école, et je crois qu'aujourd'hui, plus que jamais, on a besoin de ce genre d'investissement dans le futur par le type de programme que Chris Reagan et son équipe sont en train de bâtir à l'université McGill. McGill peut faire une différence dans le monde. McGill can make a difference in the world. We have for now almost 200 years, and I think this new school of public policy very much speaks to that. It is going to be an exciting few years coming up at McGill as we get ready for your alma mater's 200 years young celebration in 2021. And it's also not only a celebration of 200 years, but really a celebration of the future as we embark on McGill's third century. And if you enjoyed this evening's Road to 200 presentation, you'll want to stay tuned because, as has been pointed out, there are many more events that will be planned in the Toronto area in 2019, 2020, and 2021. Our second annual McGill Toronto Excellence Awards in June. And also, you can keep up to date with all of these things through our excellent Road to 200 website. The Faculty of Arts, for example, we've set up a bicentennial committee to be able to engage not only McGillians who are in Montreal, but McGillians in Toronto, across Canada, across the world, in our celebrations of the 200th anniversary. Merci beaucoup à tous. I'm very happy to have been here this evening. I want to thank everyone who organized, but I don't get the final word because this is an alumni event. So the final word will go to our Toronto branch volunteer, Jamie Lee Rogers.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Lee Rogers, and I'm the co-president of the McGill Alumni Association of Toronto. And I simply want to thank you for your presence. I only have a few words of wisdom to provide. Please stick around and head back to the lounge where you can have a drink, enjoy some appetizers, mingle with your fellow alumni, meet our guests, and of course, party like it's 1999 or whenever your graduation year was. In other words, enjoy the holiday party. Thank you.
Yeah.